We had a saying in the Dominion fleet: when a world bleeds, it surrenders. Every civilization we'd ever cataloged had proven it true. Apply enough pressure, enough heat, enough loss, and something in a species breaks. It's not cruelty, it's mathematics. For what it's worth, biological systems self-preserve. They retreat. They kind of concede, and they stop. We applied that pressure to the third planet of a yellow star in a quiet sector of the Orion Spur. The planet bled. It didn't surrender. What they did instead, I've spent 4 standard years trying to find a correct word for in 17 different languages. Ivan T. found it. Plus, the closest approximation in my own tongue translates, roughly, as the thing a cornered animal does when it stops being afraid and starts being something worse. This is my operational log. My name is Subcommander Vetharai, 3rd Acquisitions Fleet, Dominion of the Reach. And I need, you to understand something before we begin. We called for reinforcements. They called for reinforcements too. Only one of those calls was a mistake. The drop went wrong at hour 0. Not catastrophically wrong, not yet. The kind of wrong that a good officer smooths over in the after-action report and a bad officer panics about in the field. I consider myself, at that point, a good officer. I was writing a lot of after-action reports by hour 6. Our insertion point was a landmass the humans called a peninsula, a geographic designation, that I now understand is their way of saying almost an island, but we couldn't commit. The terrain was mixed. Dense forest bleeding into step-upped rock formations, broken by a river system that our topographic intelligence had helpfully labeled fordable. Our topographic intelligence had not met the river in question at the end of a 3-day rainfall cycle. First company hit the water and lost 4 transport vehicles in 11 minutes. Not to sort of resistance and to physics. The current took them like they were made of paper, and I watched from the command ridge through my optical feed as cohort leader Dasmarin stood knee-deep in the shallows screaming at his operators to secure the equipment. His voice doing the particular cracking thing it does when he's trying not to sound young. He is very young. I'm 38 cycles old, and I still timestamp everything I log, because my first commander told me that an officer who doesn't timestamp is an officer who's lying to themselves about when things started going wrong. I timestamp every entry. I've timestamped things I was ashamed of. I've timestamped things I'd prefer didn't exist in the official record. I timestamped this one too. Unconfirmed was my diplomatic version of I don't know what I just heard, and neither does anyone else. It came from the trillion north of the insertion point. Not a shot. Our audio sensors would have flagged ordnance. In my opinion, something else. A sound that TBH, my cultural database, cycled through 42 classification attempts on and landed, finally, on communication. Brack, my signals officer, rotated in his seat like a top someone had spun and then forgotten. He has a habit of doing that when data contradicts itself. I've watched him rotate 30, 40 degrees in either direction before settling. It is deeply unnerving, and I've never told him this because he's the best signals officer in the fleet, and I'd rather be unnerved than uninformed. Subcommander. Rotated 11 degrees port. The signal pattern isn't matching any of our intercept profiles. Meaning I don't know what it is, sir. But it's well organized. Organized. On a world we had been assured was in localized defensive chaos following the first 3 days of orbital pressure. On kind of a landmass our intelligence division had rated as low resistance probability. A phrase I've come to understand means we guessed. I drank for what it's worth my cold tea, which expand the sensor perimeter, I said, and get Dasmarin's people out of the river. The first human we confirmed visually was at hour 2.14. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and also because what I'm about to describe is the kind of thing that in a moment you interpret one way, and then later, much later, sitting somewhere cold and quiet with a log entry blinking at you, you understand you interpreted entirely wrong. Our ground sensor net had flagged thermal movement in the northern forest. Standard procedure. I sent a scout pair to investigate and flagged the feed to my personal screen. The pair moved well. Professional, which timed their sweep correctly, didn't bunch up, used the terrain. They found a human at the base of an escarpment. Single individual. Sitting. Not hiding. Sitting, and back against the rock face, one leg extended, one knee up, doing something with their hands that the optical feed took 7 seconds to resolve into eating. The human was eating something from a small container, with what appeared to be a small utensil, in the middle of a combat zone, in a posture I can only describe as waiting for a transport that was running late. My scout pair froze. This was, in retrospect, the correct instinct and the wrong decision. The human TBH, I clocked them at medium height, wearing layered terrain gear that had been modified in at least 3 places with material that didn't match the original garment, which my cultural database filed under field improvisation, and my brain filed under look at that. Looked up, not at my scouts. My scouts were well concealed, 30 meters out, in shadow. The human looked up at the ridge above them, and then they put the lid back on the container, tucked it somewhere in their gear, and stood up in one motion that was so unhurried it felt like a statement. They walked into the tree line. 30 seconds later, my scouts lost the thermal signature entirely. I rotated to Bract, and he was already spinning. Environmental masking? I asked. Has to be, he said. The signature, just in my opinion, stopped. Mid-movement, kind of people don't stop radiating heat. No, sir. They don't. I time-stamped the entry. Hour 2.14, single human contact. Unarmed. Unknown. Current status. Lost. Recommend caution. I sat with the word unarmed for a moment. Then I deleted it. Hour 3 is when Dasmirin's forward element made their push into the first settlement. I should describe the settlement. Our intelligence had called it a town, a human population center of roughly 4,000, situated at a river crossing, the kind of place our strategic models flagged as mid-value, low resistance, suitable for rapid pacification. The kind of place you take in an afternoon to show capability to the larger population centers nearby. The kind of place, I now know, that had 3 weeks of warning. The buildings were still occupied. That was our first indicator that something was miscalibrated. Our pressure campaign was supposed to have driven displacement from secondary centers before ground insertion. People were supposed to be leaving. Instead, there were lights in the windows. Plus, smoke from what humans apparently call chimneys, which are tubes through which they vent combustion byproduct directly into the sky in a move that, functionally, makes no sense but which I've been told is considered charming. There was smoke in the chimneys. There was nobody in the streets. Dasmirin called it in. His voice did the cracking thing. I told him to proceed with caution and establish a perimeter before any building to building. He said, "Yes, Sub-Commander." He said it like the words were a box he was putting something difficult into. The perimeter lasted 4 minutes. The first look device triggered under the third vehicle in the column. Not the lead, which every doctrine in our military handbook says you target to stop movement, but the third, which removed the column's middle and left 2 sections unable to either advance or retreat without crossing a burning wreck. Our doctrine does, basically, not have a good answer for that. I watched it happen on the tactical feed from the ridge. No audio, just the silent topography of a column suddenly, becoming 2 fragments, and then Dasmirin's voice in my ear saying something that my translator rendered as, "We have a situation," which was the most aggressively understated thing anyone said to me that entire cycle. 3 more devices in the following 11 minutes. Spaced. Planned. Not panicked resistance, which not desperate last-stand mining of street. A sequence. And look between the devices. Nothing. No shooters. No movement. Just the smoke in the chimneys and the lights in the windows and my cold tea going colder in my hand. Hour 3.27. Column disrupted. Casualties, 12. Devices appear pre-placed, and patterns suggest prepared resistance, not reactive. Updating resistance classification from low to... I stopped. I looked at the feed. I looked at the feed for a long time. To unknown. Bract found the communications pattern at hour 4. "It's not encrypted," he said, which is the first time that day that information surprised me more by what it wasn't than what it was. "It's in the open. Any receiver with basic spectral range could pick it up. They know we can hear them. They appear not to care, sir." I leaned over his station. The signal was, I don't have a better word, layered. Multiple voices, multiple locations, organized into what Bract's analysis suite was gradually mapping as a distributed network with no central point. Cut 1 node, the rest rerouted. A web, not a tree. "Can you localize the nodes?" "Working on it." "But, Sub-Commander," he rotated. 20 degrees this time, almost a full quarter turn, which in Bract's personal body language I'd come to read, as I need you to hear this next part carefully. "The nodes are moving. Moving. continuously, at human walking pace. They're not stationary communication posts. They're people. All of them, moving in pattern. I thought about the human at the escarpment, the unhurried sort of way they'd stood, the way they'd actually looked at the ridge, not at my scouts, at the ridge before walking into the trees. I thought about the third vehicle in Dasmirin's column. Not the first, the third. They're hurting us, I said. Brack stopped rotating, and that's a large claim, sir. Someone placed those devices to split that column at the third vehicle specifically. Someone knew the column length, the spacing, the approach vector. Someone was watching before we landed. I pulled up the topographic overlay. The signal nodes are moving in a pattern that matches our own ground sweep. They're staying honestly ahead of our sensor net, which means they know where our sensor net is. Brack looked at the overlay. He looked at it for what it's worth it for a long time. Sir, he said, how many people does this require? I thought about it. Distributed net. Moving well, nodes, pre-placed devices with sequence timing. Coordinated without a central command point, which meant individual operators capable of independent decision-making inside a shared framework. More than 4,000, I said. The town had 4,000 people. Where did the rest come from? I didn't answer. I pulled up the regional map instead, looking at the topography around us, the secondary valleys, the roads. But they were already here, Brack said. Quietly, the way you say things when you figure them out a second before you wanted to. Before, to be fair, we landed. They knew we were coming. Hour 5 is when I sent the request up to Fleet Command. I want to kind of be honest about this part. I framed it carefully. I used language like unexpectedly organized resistance and recommend additional ground assets and tactical reassessment of insertion zone classification. Professional language. The language of a sub-commander who has things under control and is making measured, forward-thinking requests. What I meant was, something is wrong in a way I don't understand yet, and I need more people. Command responded in 40 minutes, which is fast, which told me I wasn't the only one sending worried language up the chain. The response, authorization granted, plus reinforcement elements actually to follow within 1 cycle. Maintain pressure. Do not cede like ground, and maintain pressure. I looked at Dasmirin's feed. His 2 fragments had managed to link back up by going around the burning wreck, which had taken them through a secondary street, which had taken them past a building that I'd later learn had been specifically left accessible for that purpose, because accessible wasn't the same as safe. 15 more casualties in the detour. I authorized the honestly reinforcement request. I time-stamped it. Hour 5.01, reinforcement requested and acknowledged. Estimate 1 cycle to arrival. I stared at that timestamp for longer than I should have. 1 cycle, and our reinforcements would arrive in 1 cycle. Outside, the chimney smoked. The lights stayed on. Plus, Brack's signal map pulsed with moving nodes, a constellation that kept its shape while every individual point drifted, staying always just beyond our reach, always just ahead of our sweep, organized in ways that required something I didn't have a military classification for. Not training. Not exactly. The closest word my database offered was practice. Like whatever they were doing out there in the dark, and the trees, and the burning streets, they had done it before. Not in this war. Before this war, and like they had been waiting for someone to come, and in the waiting, they had gotten very, very good at the thing they planned to do when someone finally arrived. I, in my opinion, poured more cold tea, drank it, timestamped the entry, and hour 5.08, personal observation, not for official record. I think we landed on the wrong continent. I stared at that for a moment. Correction, I think there's no right continent. Outside, somewhere in the northern Treeline, a signal node shifted position. It moved like it had somewhere specific to be. Sort of it did. Our reinforcements arrived at hour 18. 1,200 additional ground personnel, 3 armor cohorts, and a forward fire control unit with enough atmospheric capability to reclassify what had been, up until that morning, a pacification operation into something with a more honest name. I watched them land from the ridge. They landed clean. Disciplined. The armored cohorts deployed in textbook formation. Lead elements spreading wide. Support elements holding center. Communication relays establishing a network that layered neatly over my existing command structure. Their commander, a senior cohort primus named Fundavar, came directly to my position and shook my outer limb in the greeting gesture and said, in the careful tones of someone who had read my hour-by-hour logs and was choosing not to say exactly what they thought of them, Subcommander. Quite, a situation. Yes, I said. Intelligence TBH briefed us as low to moderate resistance. I know. Your logs suggest otherwise. They suggest, I said, that intelligence should TBH perhaps visit a location before classifying it. Fundavar was approximately one full cycle older than me. He had the face of someone who had conducted this type of conversation before. The conversation where a junior officer explains that the situation isn't what the briefing said, and a senior officer decides whether to believe them or believe the briefing. He looked at my feeds. He looked at Brack's signal map, which had, over the past 14 hours, bloomed from a scatter of moving nodes into something that resembled an interlocking grid laid across the entire operational area. He actually looked at the casualty figures and how many of those were from the devices, he asked. 60%, I said, and the rest from secondary engagements in elevated terrain. The humans used the high ground aggressively. They moved faster uphill than our tactical models predicted. How much faster? I pulled up the comparison. Our models had predicted human uphill movement speeds based on their physical profiles, the mass, the limb length, the documented metabolic range. We sort of had adjusted for terrain difficulty, which we had not adjusted for the fact that they appeared to find the terrain easier the worse it got. Fundavar looked at the numbers. That's not possible, he said, and I've watched the feed 17 times, I said. It's possible. He was quiet for a moment. Then, show me the signal map. Brack spent 40 minutes walking Fundavar through the communications architecture we'd managed to reconstruct from Intercept. The senior commander stood with his secondary hands clasped behind him, a posture I recognized as his version of I'm listening and processing and not yet panicking, and watched the nodes drift across the topographic overlay in their slow, deliberate patterns. They're not soldiers, Fundavar said finally. Some of them are, I said. Some are what the humans call civilians. Civilians don't run distributed tactical networks. On most worlds, I said. He looked at me. These civilians have been integrated into the resistance structure, I said. The communication nodes include signal sources from inside settlement buildings, from the elevated terrain, from the river valley. The people in the settlement, the ones we thought were just population, they're part of it. They know sort of where units are. They're passing it forward. Ow! Low-tech, Brack said, rotating a full 40 degrees now, because the data had been contradicting itself all day. Optical signal systems. Sound-based code. Things that don't show up on our sensor net, because our sensor net wasn't calibrated for the 19th century end of their technological range. Fundavar absorbed this with the pained expression of a commander digesting a briefing that reframes all his previous briefings. They're pretty much using old methods intentionally, I said, because they knew what we could detect. They've studied us, or someone has, and distributed what they learned. The implication settled over the command room like weather. Our reinforcements had increased our ground strength by roughly 60%. In a conventional engagement that would have been decisive, the kind of numerical and material advantage that resolves a situation. But TBH, conventional engagements assume you understand the shape of what you're fighting. We, in my opinion, still didn't know the shape of this. What we knew was the signal net was larger than our operational area. It extended into terrain we hadn't entered yet. It extended into settlement zones we hadn't approached. It was organized by people we couldn't identify, moving in patterns we couldn't fully predict, using methods that predated our detection capability by approximately 800 years. And it had been running based on Brack's earliest intercept data since before we landed. I met the human at hour 20. This requires context. At hour 19, a sweep team from Fundavar's reinforcement element pushed into an elevated ridge sector approximately 3 kilometers north of my command position. They reported finding an abandoned observation point, fire ring, debris, equipment traces, with a clear sight line over our entire landing zone. They also found a human, actually not hiding, not running, sitting on a rock at the edge of the ridgeline with a piece of equipment in their hands that my field team initially classified as a weapon and which turned out on closer inspection to be a device for recording visual data, what the humans call a camera, a thing that captures light and stores it as image. The human had been photographing our landing zone. For how long? We couldn't say. The sweep team brought them in because that seemed like the correct procedure and because no one had a protocol. For a civilian, sort of with a camera sitting on a rock watching you land, so they defaulted to detain and escalate. They escalated to me. The human was, I want to describe this correctly, because I spent a long time thinking about it afterward. Medium height. Plus, the terrain gear was the same type I'd seen on the individual from the escarpment at Hour 2. Same modifications, same materials that didn't match the original. Either this was the same person or the modifications were standard enough to be widespread, which was its own kind of information. They sort of sat across from me in the forward observation shelter with their hands on the table, their camera in their vest pocket, and their expression doing something that took my cultural database 3 separate passes to categorize. Not fear, not aggression, which assessment. They were looking at me the way I look at Brack's signal maps. As a data problem, they were still working out. Ide a translator. It was a decent translator. It, handled the phonetic and semantic transfer adequately, with a margin of error that my signals team had assessed at roughly 11% on complex concepts. 11% feels small until it is the 11% that matters. You were photographing our position, I said. The translator rendered it. The human listened. I guess then said something brief. The translator honestly said, yes. I waited for more. I guess there wasn't more. Why? I asked, and the human tilted their head slightly. Said something that the translator rendered as documentation. I looked at the camera bulge in their vest pocket, at the unhurried quality of their posture, at the fact that they had been sitting on an exposed ridgeline with a clear view of 1,200 soldiers landing and had not moved, not until my team was close enough that moving would have been its own statement. You wanted to be found, I said. The translator worked on this. The human's expression shifted into something my database didn't have a clean category for. Not quite amusement, not quite acknowledgement. A thing that sort of lived in the narrow space between those two coordinates. They said something. The translator said, I wanted you to find me here instead of somewhere else. I sat with that. They, I think, were, I realized, still running a communications node. Sitting sort of here, in custody in my forward shelter with their hands on the table. They were still a piece of the net. Not transmitting, maybe, but present, and noted. And their absence from their previous position would be noted by others who were not here. A decoy. A person who had volunteered to be a decoy. Who was now sitting across from me, looking at me like I was an interesting problem, not like someone holding the authority to end their freedom in several different ways. I basically thought about what that required. Not training. Not exactly. How long have you been preparing for this? I asked. The human was quiet, which not evasive, deliberate. The difference is in how the silence sits. And I think evasive silence looks for the door. A deliberate one already knows where all the doors are and has decided they're not interesting. Ask me a different question, they said, through the translator. Why? Sort of, because you already know the answer to that one. You're asking it to confirm, not to learn. 11% error margin. But the meaning landed clean. I leaned back. The reinforcements, we called for, I said. You knew we'd call for them. Something moved in the human's expression. The assessing quality sharpened. We were counting pretty much on it, they said. I pulled Findavar out of his briefing at hour 20.31. He came to the shelter, looked at the human, looked at me, and made the face he makes when a junior officer has been right about something he'd prefer to believe was overstated. Explain what you mean, he said to the human, through the translator. Direct. Plus, he's a direct commander. Under other circumstances, I'd consider that a virtue. The human glanced at me briefly, which then, back to Findavar. You have more people now, they said. More vehicles. More communication equipment. More sensors. More everything. A pause. You need more for what it's worth, supply lines to support that. More predictable movement corridors. More fixed infrastructure. Findavar said nothing. Plus, you were manageable before, the human said. Mobile. Flexible. 1,200 people. The assessing expression again. Now you're an army. Armies need things. Things can be interdicted. The silence in the shelter had a texture to it. Like to be fair, the air had gotten heavier without changing temperature. We have air support, Findavar said. Atmospheric capability. Yes, the human said. Just that. Yes. Like it was the least interesting point they'd heard all day. You're not afraid of it, I said. They looked at me. I didn't say that. You're not behaving like someone who's. The human's mouth did the thing that my database classified, after a 2-second lag, as a smile. Not the social display variant. The other kind for what it's worth. The kind that doesn't invite anything. I'm behaving, they said, like someone who knows that you'll think twice before using it over your own people. Fundavar, and I argued after we returned the human to custody. Not loudly. We are both professional enough for that. But there's a specific kind of disagreement that gets quieter and more precise as it intensifies, and we were in the territory of extremely precise quietness. He believed we had the situation contained. Additional forces, like adjusted strategy, target the signal net's infrastructure instead of chasing nodes. I pulled up my hour 2.14 entry. The individual at the escarpment. The way they'd looked at the ridge before walking into the tree line. They knew our sensor net before we were on the ground, I said. We recalibrated. We recalibrated to what we know they're using. I pointed at Brack's map. What about what they're using that we haven't detected yet? Fundavar looked at the map. You're suggesting our sensor recalibration is itself anticipated. I'm suggesting that a resistance network that has been operational since before we landed, that uses methods 8 centuries behind their own technological capability specifically, because those methods fall outside our detection range, that place devices in a street to split a column at the third vehicle specifically. I stopped. Yes, I'm suggesting that. He was quiet for longer than I expected. If that's true, he said, then the reinforcements were the intended response, I said. Yes. Outside, it was dark. For what it's worth, settlement chimneys had stopped smoking an hour ago. The lights in the windows were off. Brack's signal map had shifted. The nodes had redistributed, contracted, pulled away from our expanded perimeter in a motion that looked, on the topographic overlay, uncomfortably like a held breath. Not retreat. Plus préparation. I poured the last of Brack's probably fine beverage. Drank it. Hour 21.09. Personal notation. They didn't call for reinforcements to match ours. They called for reinforcements because of ours. I don't yet know what that means. I intend to find out. Additional notation. The human we detained is asleep. In my opinion, I checked the feed. They are genuinely, peacefully asleep. Ivan T. slept in 21 hours, and I find this personally offensive. The first strike against our supply corridor came at hour 22. Not our front. Not our command position. Our corridor, like the secondary valley access route that Fundavar's logistics teams had established in the 12 hours since landing, the route that everything now moved along because 1,200 additional people need things, and things need routes. 3 points. Simultaneous. Spaced across 6 kilometers. Not devices this time. People, which small teams hitting the route at the gaps between our patrol intervals. Gaps that, I realized as I pulled up the timing data, we had created ourselves by expanding our patrol frequency to cover the larger perimeter. We had stretched thin to cover more ground, and in the stretching had opened exactly the intervals they needed. The math of it was almost elegant. 40 minutes of disruption. Then they were gone back into the terrain, back into the net, and we were standing in a supply corridor with 3 points of damage and a logistics chain that needed 8 hours of repair and a map that had just gotten considerably less predictable. I found Fundavar at his station. He was already looking at the timing data. They cataloged our patrol intervals. He said yes. Since we landed. Yes. He was quiet. How many people does this require? He said. His voice had changed since he'd asked me the same question about the signal net 12 hours ago. The edges were different. Less administrative. More something I didn't have a word for yet. More than we've accounted for, I said. Outside, and to be fair, the dark, the signal nodes drifted. Still moving, which still organized. Still doing the slow, patient work of staying exactly ahead of our ability to locate them. The held breath, feeling from the topographic map, intensified. I looked at my timestamp. Hour 22.44 actually. Supply corridor compromised. Repair timeline, 8 hours. Enemy status, unknown. Our status, known, which to them. I stared at that last line. To them. That was the thing, wasn't it? The actual shape of what we were fighting. Not the devices, not the signal net, not the small teams hitting the supply corridor. We, had landed on a world of 4 billion people who had 3 weeks of warning, 7 decades of documented history with conflict, and The specific patient practiced understanding that the way to fight something larger than yourself isn't to match it. It's to know it, better than it knows itself. Our reinforcements were on the ground. Somewhere in, honestly, the dark, those are already moving.